So good evening, everyone, and welcome to another exciting installment. Tonight, we're going to be talking about a later period than we usually talk about. We're going to be talking about the Persian influence on the Bible and on, you could say, Jewish texts in general after the Bible as well, because we really start to see that that impact after, like, look, let's face it. Okay, so we have, if you look at a timeline, the conquest of Babylonia by Cyrus, that's in 539 BCE. So that's the beginning of the Persian period for us, essentially, the Judean Persian period, right? So that's like 539, 538. 538 is when Cyrus started to give permission to everyone to go back, right? So, and then that Persian period doesn't end till 333 BCE, when Persia, of course, falls to Alexander. So that's 200 years that we have Judeans, Babylonians and Judeans, right? Jews living under Persian rule and influence. And we can absolutely see certain ways that it seems to impact. Now, a lot of times when we talk about kind of the Bible and biblical texts, we like to forget that. Like, people don't talk about it much. It's like we just lived under Persian rule for 200 years, and this had zero effect on anything. You know, the Megillat Esther, and that's it, right? No, first of all, I would say, oh yeah, Megillat Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah and Haggai, Zechariah and Malachi, but people don't think of those books, right? So we are going to talk a little bit about those books. So we have books, biblical books, that are written during the Persian period. And then we have extra biblical books. We have books that didn't make it into the biblical canon that show very clear Persian influence. And in general, Jewish thought, and at this point we can call it Jewish. There's this whole argument when people are studying, especially biblical texts, like especially Tanakh, at what point do we call them Israelite or Judean? And at what point do we call them Jews, right? Growing up, we call them all Jews. We're all Jews, you know, from the beginning, right? From Yaakov, we're Jews, right? But once you start studying academically, you're kind of not allowed to do that. And they're like, when can you start calling them Jews? You can start calling them Jews really after the return to Zion. And I mean, one of the things, I mean, we do point to the Megillah, even if it's later, because in Megillah, who is called a Yehudi, a Jew?
Mordechai.
And Mordechai is from which tribe?
Binyamin.
So he's not a Judahite. He's not a Yehudi, a Judahite. He's a Yehudi. At this point, that means a Jew, right? You can say, well, he's from Judea, but it doesn't matter. At this point, this is the name and we understand it. Now, of course, the dating of the Megillah is a big question, but there does seem to be this aspect of it during Persian rule, that you kind of belong to this people. And also at this point, you have a people who are no longer constrained to a specific area. This already happened with the Babylonian exile, but it continues under Persian rule, that you have Jews in a variety of places, and they all consider themselves Jewish and connected, right? One of the examples in one of the communities that we know about that's living under Persian rule outside of the land of Israel, and I'm not going over their text again because I know I've done it with you guys a million times, the Jews of Elephantine, right? So those Jews are considered Jews. They get a letter saying now Pesach is coming, time to celebrate Pesach. It doesn't matter that they're in, to use a technical term, they're in Yenem Zeit Welt in Egypt, right? They're at the very end, they're very southern tip of Egypt, right? And like, they're so far away from anything, and yet it's important for them to know when Pesach is coming. And not only that, but when their temple is destroyed, who are they going to write to? Well, of course, they're going to write to the Kohen Gadol, the high priest in Jerusalem, because they're Jews, You could say, well, they're Israelites. No one's thinking that way anymore. They're all part of this one people, okay? And that's who they write to, and they assume that the Kohen Gadol is going to take care of them. And when they don't hear back from him, who do they write to? They write to the governor of Judea and Samaria. Why? Because they're Jews. It doesn't matter that they're living on the border with Nubia, right? You can't get much farther. But they write to the governor of Judea and Samaria because this guy is the guy who is responsible for Jews, right? Certainly for the worship of the Jewish God. So that's who they write to when they don't hear back from the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And so we have this very kind of a vibrant diaspora that lives during the Persian period, at the same time as we have the growing community in Judea. So let's actually start by talking about the biblical books. I hope that we have a lot to cover in this class. So one of the things I wanted to say, so I sent you guys the article that I have from this book, Iran, Israel, and the Jews. I sent you my article. You don't need to read it for this class. I just thought it might be interesting for you.
We'll get graded on it?
What?
We'll get graded on it?
You will not. When I taught a class at Stern College, and I would go on what I would call important tangents, right? It's like I found out that they didn't know what kriyuchtiv was or meant, and I'd go on to say, this is an important tangent. I write this on the board, and I had it as a multiple choice section on the exam. The important tangents, they were tested on them in a multiple choice. They were so happy because it meant they hadn't wasted their time. They had not wasted their time learning this stuff because it was on the exam. So live and learn, right? But no, you guys will not be tested. But I sent you the article because I thought you might find it interesting. It's an article that talks about Persian influence at Qumran specifically, and we're going to get to that a little later. And another article we will hopefully get to, which is David Brodsky's article on Tobit, and I've mentioned it before, and it's finally published. This is the festschrift for Larry Schiffman. And David Brodsky's article is right after mine, not because he's anything less than me, but because Brand comes before Brodsky in alphabetical order. And so that is an article that I'm going to be referring to. Unfortunately, it's not as accessible because this is a Brill book, so it's super expensive. And they purposely didn't make PDFs of the article available. So such is life. But so let's dive into kind of the return to Zion. So we're going to talk about, again, in this class, we're talking about Persian influence in biblical books and afterwards. The Megillah itself is problematic, okay? Problematic in different ways. And it not only is it problematic, but it itself caused issues when Jews in the medieval period were trying to create a chronology, right? So, and I'm going to pause here. Everyone mute yourselves, please. If you don't have a question, please mute yourselves. Take the time to mute yourselves. Okay. So when the Seder Olam Rabbah was trying to do a chronology, like how do we know how many years the world exists, right? When we write the year, the Hebrew year, how do we know? Seder Olam Rabbah, okay? Seder Olam Rabbah did a chronology tracing from the creation all the way through. And the problem was that when Seder Olam Rabbah had to take the Megillah and compare the Megillah to Ezra and Nehemiah, he got into real problems. And his way of solving the problems was to say Artaxerxes, okay, simply means his majesty for Persian kings. Like Paro for Egypt, it's a general name for Persian kings. And that means when they say Artaxerxes, they mean Darius, they mean Dariavesh, right? So, they can mean anyone, right? So in that way, he could kind of compress different periods and he makes it work. The problem is, of course, that that's not true. There are kings named Artaxerxes in the Persian chronology, right? So, and that's Artaxerxes, right? The same way you have Achashverosh, right, who is an actual king. You have, in any way, at any rate, the Megillah messes a lot of things up. We're going to talk about it more next time. Now let's delve into actual Persian stuff that we can kind of put our fingers on. However, I do want to say that the Megillah reflects some real kind of well-known facts about the Persian Empire, okay, and certain things, the way the Persian Empire worked. Not the thing about not being able to take back a command, but other aspects of it are absolutely kind of things that were well known about the Persian Empire and are reflected in the Megillah. Okay, so if we take a look, I'm going to share. I'm going to make sure that I've got the right thing in front of me, and then I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to show you. Here we are, the lovely Cyrus Cylinder. You see the Cyrus Cylinder? Great. Yeah. Okay. All right. So here you see the Cyrus Cylinder. The Cyrus Cylinder does not have anything to do technically with Judea. I want to say this because people have this misunderstanding. I know people are making faces like, well, I of course knew that. I understand. Some of you are like, well, who thought that? No. So this is something that people make this mistake. The Cyrus Cylinder itself, okay, the Cyrus Cylinder itself is not about Judea. Okay, the Cyrus Cylinder is about Babylonians going back home. Okay, we're going to look at it in just a second. All right, so first let me read the chapter in Ezra, right, that was so important when they found the Cyrus Cylinder. In other words, we had this chapter of Ezra, right? And for a long time, I'll read it in English just so we can do it very quickly. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Yirmiyahu might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, Koresh, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it also in writing, saying, so says Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth has the Lord, the God of heaven, given me, and he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whosoever there is among you of all his people, his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And whosoever is left in any place where he lives, let the men of his place help him with silver and with gold and with good and with beasts, beside the freewill offering for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. Okay, so this quote, what is this quote saying? Let me stop the share for a bit. So what is this quote saying? This quote is saying, Cyrus is telling everyone, you can go back, you can build the temple of God, and he's naming God, right? You can build the temple of God, you can collect money and go back, you can live there, and you can rebuild the temple. And biblical scholars were like, well, this is a cute little dream. Okay, I mean, clearly they were able to go back, but he didn't have a proclamation like that. I mean, that's a little bit far-fetched. All right. And so what we have, and let me open, you guys prefer it when I share my screen, right? When I read these texts, or do you guys not mind if because I sent you the handout. So can we just read it all together? Is that okay? Okay, so I'm reading, okay, so if you look at, this was the Cyrus Cylinder translation I sent to you, okay? And, oh no, it's got the wrong pages. Well, this is not useful. Hold on, let me just see for a second. Cyrus Cylinder, here we are, no, it's not, it has the right pages. Okay. All right, so I'm reading now. I'm looking at the second page of the handout, which is page 315 of volume 2 of Context of Scripture. And he says, when I entered, I'm looking at the right-hand column, the second column, okay? When I entered Babylon in a peaceful manner, I took up my lordly lane in the royal palace amidst rejoicing and happiness. Marduk, the great Lord, caused the magnanimous people of Babylon to something me, and I daily attended to his worship. My vast army moved about Babylon in peace. I did not permit anyone to frighten the people of Sumer and Akkad. I sought the welfare of the city of Babylon and all its sacred centers. As for the citizens of Babylon upon whom he imposed corvée, which was not the God's will and not befitting them, I relieved their weariness and freed them from their service. Marduk, the great Lord, rejoiced over my good deeds. He sent gracious blessings upon me, Cyrus, the king who worships him, and upon Cambyses, the son who is my offspring, and upon all my army, and in peace before him we move about. Okay, what's going on here? Who is Marduk? Guys, who is Marduk?
Mordecai.
No, who's Marduk? Nice, but Mordecai, his name is problematic. Comes from Marduk,
The head of the Babylonian pantheon.
right? Marduk is the king of Babylon, right? He's the king of Babylonia. So Cyrus is saying, Marduk's on my side. I worship Marduk, Babylonian people. You can dwell in peace. We'll worship Marduk, have your temples, right? Everything's, and I'll move about with my army in peace. Exactly how peaceful he and his army moved about Babylonia, that's something else. But certainly in this, certainly in this, excuse me, certainly in this, sorry, I was distracted by something. Certainly in this cylinder, what's being presented is that Cyrus is promoting Babylonian worship of the Babylonian God in Babylonia, right? In Babylon, all right? And the idea, and he's using terms, and he's not talking about his own gods, he's talking about Marduk, Marduk, Marduk. And when they went back and said, oh, here's this text saying to everyone, dwell in peace, worship at his temples, everything's great, which is very much against the standard Near Eastern practice of we win, we wreck your temples and take your gods, right? Because our God just won, all right? Very much against that idea is saying, no, you guys dwell in your place, worship your gods. I am supporting you, all right? And so here, if we then go back to the biblical text and say, oh, okay, so he's telling the Judeans, I worship your God, right? And your God wants you to rebuild your temple. Go ahead, go back and rebuild your temple. I too worship your God, and your God's going to bless me, right? So that's now in keeping with a stated policy. And we have another kind of letter from him that's very similar to what the book of Ezra is quoting. And the book of Ezra and the books of Ezra and Nehemiah quote a lot of different historical documents, and some of them clearly, while there are arguments about some of them, is this historical or is this made up? Some of them really seem pretty clearly taken from an archive and copied. So this could actually have been a letter. Then there's the question of, well, why did Cyrus care? Because Babylonians were important. That was a big group of people, right? So that was a big group of people. But why would he care about the Jews? Why would he care about, let's call them even Judeans? And so one of the possibilities is that you actually had Jews high up in the court, right? We know that Nehemiah was high up in the court, for example. I say perhaps there were enough Jews that were high up in the court that he wanted them to be happy, and he's like, okay, I'm gonna write a letter and keep everyone happy. Also, and it just I'm gonna remind everyone, mute yourselves, please. Also, in terms of where Israel is always the in-between place, right? You don't want Israel rebelling when you have to deal with Egypt. They're the path to Egypt. They're always, you don't want, it's just not a place, it's a place that you want to be quiet and happy in general, right? And of course, Judeans have the tradition of rebelling, which we actually see not only, we see it in Ezra and Nehemiah actually, right? In letters written after Cyrus and Darius about how the Jews are rebellious. Okay, I see that there's some comments here. Let me take a look. Wasn't Cyrus historically a Zoroastrian, or did that only begin with the Sassanid dynasty? It did not begin with the Sassanid dynasty. On the contrary, Zoroastrianism goes way, 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 way back. What the Persian kings worshipped was a form of Zoroastrian under the Achaemenid religion, right? And it's not clear how much we can confidently say about Zoroastrianism based on the Achaemenid worship. But yes, it was certainly a development of Zoroastrianism, and certainly they considered it Zoroastrianism. Did Cyrus have a modus operandi of manipulating his conquered subjects by identifying himself as a co-religionist? Perhaps he really did worship the various deities, but didn't pick a favorite. I think that absolutely he was hedging his bets. I don't think that he felt that you had to be particularly monotheistic. Certainly later on, we know that Darius supports the building of the temple and says, and bring sacrifices in honor of me and myself. Like, in other words, so it's generally considered a wise move. Just keep all the gods happy. Why not? Right? Why not? So I don't think he was particularly monotheistic in that sense. Like, I think he absolutely felt that this was a good idea, not just from a secular political point of view, but also from a theological point of view, making sure that everyone is worshiping their gods and putting in a good word for you and your dynasty, right? Just a moment, excuse me. Okay, so going back to what happened? So in fact, what happens when Cyrus lets people go back? We see different approaches to what this means in terms of Jewish history and Jewish redemption in the biblical texts themselves, okay? So you have books like Yeshayahu, Isaiah, right? Talking about this miraculous end time that's coming, all right? We have books we have prophecies, like the prophecies of Haggai and Zechariah, where Zerubbabel, who is an appointed ruler / administrator for Judea by the emperor, right? And he's the Pekah, the ruler of Judea, let's say. But he's from the Davidic dynasty. So there's an absolute group, certainly perhaps it's hard to know which is stronger when, okay? But certainly with Haggai and Zechariah's prophecies, what you're hearing is this idea that Zerubbabel is going to be what we would call Hamelech HaMashiach, the Messianic king, right? Who's going to bring redemption. Everyone's looking at Yirmiyahu's prophecy. It has not been a long exile. Okay, it really hasn't been a long exile. But people are ready to see this as the redemption. Now, the question is, and Zerubbabel disappears. We don't know what happened to Zerubbabel. All right, so Zerubbabel, we know, came. We know from Haggai and Zechariah that everyone was expecting him to be this, not everyone. In the prophecies, he's expected to be this Messianic king, right? He starts the work of the Beit HaMikdash. When they finish the Beit HaMikdash, they don't mention him, okay, in the book of Ezra. However, that doesn't mean he's not there, because there are all sorts of other. Ezra and Nehemiah has a very different approach, okay? The book of Ezra and Nehemiah has a very different approach to what is redemption, all right? And by redemption, just to make it clear, right, we're talking about physical, Messianic age Jewish redemption, right? We're not talking about some kind of soteriology, all right? So the idea of that redemption that you have, for example, in Yeshayahu, where you see this, lying down to the lamb sort of thing. Everyone making their everyone making their swords into plowshares. This kind of special, supernatural Messianic age that's coming. In the prophecies of Haggai and Zechariah, it's much more, here's this leader Zerubbabel. He together with Yehoshua, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, they're going to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, and they are going to bring the Messianic age. We're going to have a king and a high priest, Messianic age. There we go. All right. And then you have Ezra and Nehemiah, who are like, this is the Messianic age, guys. This is it. We got back to our land. We rebuilt our temple, and eventually we rebuilt Jerusalem. This is it. This is the promise. This is what we got. This is redemption. Okay. So what most of these have in common is that the Persian Empire is good. Okay, so I want to point that out. We don't have that in Megillah. Megillah has a very different approach to the Persian Empire. But in all of these books, the Persian Empire either is what allowed the Messianic age to come, or itself part of the Messianic age. In Ezra and Nehemiah, the Persian Empire does not need to fall. This is it. We have an autonomous region. We have our temple, and we have our capital city. Okay. Now, I want to point out something, those of you who were with me through Ezra and Nehemiah, I still think it bears repeating because it's so central in the book, and so few people talk about it outside Ezra and Nehemiah, is that in Ezra and Nehemiah, building the Beit HaMikdash, building the temple is no big deal. I shouldn't say no big deal. It's a big deal, but they get it done pretty quickly, right? It doesn't work. They don't do it under Cyrus, but they get it done under Darius, second year Darius, lickety split. It is done. They've got a working temple, okay? The big challenge is building Jerusalem, and building Jerusalem is tremendously, tremendously meaningful in Ezra and Nehemiah. It's meaningful to everyone, and it's meaningful to Nehemiah. And next week, when we talk about the Megillah and we read some of the parallel phrases we have in Nehemiah and the Megillah, you'll see that part of the whole thing, Esther, right? She says, how can I stand by and see the destruction of my people? It has a parallel to when Nehemiah says to his king, how can I stand by and see Jerusalem in ruins? How can I be happy when Jerusalem is in ruins? Now the temple's built and functioning when Nehemiah is talking to his king, but Nehemiah thinks it is a duty upon him. He must go back and he must build the city, and building the city is what gets all the surrounding nations really upset. It's building the city that brings physical threat to Nehemiah and the other Judeans, right? That's what causes everyone to say, okay, you guys are dead, right? You guys, or trying trickier means, the point where we have another parallel with the Megillah, the point where in Ezra and Nehemiah, they talk the neighboring nations right to the king and say, this is a crappy nation. This nation is bad. They're bad. They rebel all the time. And the king is like, yeah, I checked the archives and you're right. This is a bad nation. No way can they build that city. Right? You let them build a temple, that's not the issue. The issue is the city. You can't build the city because the city says something about autonomy and frankly, in power that means something to the Jews and to the surrounding nations and to the Emperor of Persia. Okay. And that's a big part of Ezra and Nehemiah, is getting the city built, right? Not just the temple, but the city. But once you have the city built, this is it. This is what we were promised. This is the return to the land, temple, the rule of our own land. This is a very different approach that we get later in Hasmonean times, which is that foreign rule is evil. That's in Judea. In Judea, they believe that, it seems like. And outside of Judea, where people who live in exile don't see foreign empires as so evil so quickly, right? But this idea that foreign rule over Israel is evil, by definition, is not particularly, we don't see it so much during the Persian period, but we do see it afterwards, certainly after the Hasmonean revolt, and that's not the Maccabean revolt, that's not a surprise, right? So let's take a step back now and talk a little bit about the influences, influences in terms of ideas. Okay, so what changes in biblical books? Okay, so a couple of more maybe nitpicky things. Okay, one of the things that's a common name for God in the Persian period is God of the heavens. Okay, just God of the heavens, and that means the Israelite God, right? So that's God of the heavens, and this idea that the heavens holds this mysterious world full of angels and mysteries, right? it's something that, an idea that grows during the Second Temple period, mainly outside of biblical literature, but we also see it in biblical literature. So for example, Zechariah sees these visions, right, that an angel has to interpret to him, right? And there's a lot more angelic interlocution, right? There's a lot more of angels having to explain things to Zechariah than we would normally have an angel having to explain something to a prophet. God still does speak to him directly, but there are a lot more angels involved, and there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in the heavens, right? Now this idea, it develops more and more, so that as we move further into the Second Temple period, we see this idea in books written after the Bible, where like for example in the book of Enoch, where Enoch goes up and he sees all the different chambers of heaven. This is where we keep the winds. This is all the different mysteries of heaven. In fact, the word raz, which we have in Daniel, right, for mystery, right, seems to be a Persian loan word, at least to a certain extent. Okay, so that there's this Persian idea of mystery, of the mystery that kind of transmits itself. And in fact, Daniel itself is considered to have a lot, the book of Daniel is considered to have a lot of, to reflect Persian influence. And it's in, I believe it's in Daniel that we get named angels. Now remember, this is the angelic, this is important. So in Persia, in Persian thought, in Zoroastrian, what we know of as Zoroastrianism, right? So you have different angels and demons, and they have different names and different responsibilities. They play different roles, and they're very important. And we start now in the Bible, we have angels. They don't get names because we don't care. They're interchangeable with each other. Okay, but in Daniel, and later, they start getting names. So the angels, we start having named angels, starting from Daniel, and then later on we have Michael and Raphael and all these these angels that suddenly get names. Now I do want to point out that except for Michael becomes the archangel. Right? And that becomes pretty important because for dualistic approaches like at Qumran, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you need someone who's going to be up against Belial, who's the big demon. Okay, so in Qumran, you have Belial's the big demon, and then God, of course, can defeat Belial. So in the War Scroll, who is Belial going up against? He's going up against Michael, right? So Michael, the archangel, Michael leads the armed forces of the children of light against the children of darkness, right? In general, Qumran has to do this kind of dance the way most, even biblical texts have to do, which is on the one hand, the Jewish people is not supposed to be led by an angel. And on the other hand, if you have God against evil, then God obviously wins. What's the battle here exactly? Right. So if you put in Michael, there are two ways, by the way, that Qumran deals with this. One, in the War Scroll, so they have Michael also, leading the children of light, but the more common way that Qumran deals with it is that they say right now is the period of Memshelet Belial, when Belial rules, which God in his mysteries has allowed. And this will come to an apocalyptic end when God destroys evil. So God's allowed this. He's left space for this. Like I shouldn't say left space for this because I'm going into Tzimtzum, which is a whole different thing, right? Because that's the Hasidic idea, right? The Kabbalistic idea, rather, of Tzimtzum, that God restricts himself so there's room for the world, right? But in Qumran thought, the idea is that God lets Belial, through his infinite mysteries, he's allowing Belial free reign during this period of time. This is when Belial rules, but this is all going to come to an end with the eschaton, right? In the apocalyptic ending, God's just going to go wipe out Belial and all his evil minions, all right? So, and in fact, this is going to connect in just a second. We're going to talk about the parallels with Persian thought in terms of that. So, so the angelic world, and this world of mysteries that's in the heavenly sphere, very much is connected to Persian, seems very much connected to Persian thought, as well as texts that name angels and give them roles. Now, not all texts name angels and give them roles. At Qumran, they generally don't name angels. They name Michael, who has this role in the war scroll. They don't care who the angels are, very much like in the biblical text. Yeah, angels, but who the heck cares who they are? Let them just do what they need to do, right? However, the angels are a very major force. You sing with the angels, you pray with the angels, you're raised up with the angels. Angels are a big deal. And we think that part of that big dealness of angels is connected to Persian influence. Note that in the books of the books of the Torah, right, of the Pentateuch, angels just do their thing and they go away, right? No one cares what angels do in their daily lives or where they go. It doesn't matter, okay? What matters is what they do on earth, and then they're gone, right? But once we come to the Second Temple period, it becomes much more important. Very possibly, this has to do with Persian influence. And again, words like Raz, mystery, which also seems to have this Persian influence, also shows that there's an interest in mysteries. So let's now go to some of the Second Temple texts, which show a clearer Persian influence. I'm going to take a pause now to take a breath and also let you ask questions and make comments. Please go ahead. What was a nice breath? Yes.
I'd like to ask, since we were talking about the Persian period in the beginning of the Second Temple, I'd like to ask maybe from a theological perspective or from a biblical perspective about the end of the prophecy. The Tanakh ends, and if you're talking about this is the redemption, why does the prophecy end just then?
Okay, all right, so great. Yeah, so there's this it's true that there's this general idea that that Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi end the period of prophecy. Not just that, but it seems the idea is that not only do they, because they end the period of prophecy, they end the period of time when you could say things are being written with Ruach HaKodesh, right? With like the Holy Spirit, right? So they're divinely inspired. So if you look at our Tanakh, our Bible, which is the Judean Bible, right? It's what the Jews of Yehuda said, okay, this is it, right? You can say Jews of Yehuda and the Galilee, right? But it's the final Bible which was sealed in the land of Israel, as opposed to, for example, Alexandria. So as I've said before, the general rule is, so first of all, they've got to be holy, and they've got to be generally accepted as holy. I mean, I think that in general, almost all of these books, not necessarily all, but almost all of these books, there was general consensus that these books have to be in. But also they have to place themselves before Haggai, or before or during Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now, you have to be able to place them in, or you could say in the period of Shivat Sion, of the return to Zion. Okay, so you have to have these books. So if you think about books that are generally dated later, okay, so Daniel, right, and academics will say Daniel is written during the Hasmonean period, during the Hellenistic period. However, Daniel places itself during the Persian period. Daniel places itself before the return to Zion. Okay, Kohelet, hey, it's written by Shlomo, right? So well before the Persian. In other words, as long as the book was considered holy and wasn't crazy, wasn't totally whacked out, right, like Jubilees, and it placed itself, right, before the Persian period, it was fine, all right? What happens when it's generally considered kind of holy, but it doesn't place itself before Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, it gets dropped, and that's what happens to Ben Sira. Ben Sira, which all the rabbis seem to know by heart when they're arguing about should we be learning Ben Sira or not, and they're all just quoting things. They're just quoting verses from Ben Sira left and right, and they're explaining where the parallels are in the Torah, the Tanakh, really, in the general biblical corpus. So and they all know it. They all know it. They seem to know it by heart. And they're leaving it out. And the answer is because, of course, they know when Ben Sira lived. Ben Sira lived during the Ptolemaic period in Israel. So that's not, it doesn't work. It's not in during Shivat Zion. It can't get in. Now, in the Alexandrian Jewish community, they didn't have such strict rules. There, they had to consider it to have, probably what the rules were something like, it has to have a good message. It has to have a good message. It has to have something in it that's kind of holy or just important, and it can't be crazy. It has to have a kind of a consensus. Like, so Jubilees doesn't get into the Alexandrian Jewish Bible. Enoch doesn't get in. Okay, the books that you got in, Tobit is one of the books we're going to be looking at in just a second. Tobit gets in, okay, because Tobit has good messages, right? Now, Tobit also places itself fairly early, even though it's clearly not, but other books don't have to. Books of the Maccabees, they get into the Alexandrian Jewish Bible. Now, when did it become a commonplace idea that prophecy ended with Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi? That's a more complicated question, because Nehemiah himself talks about meeting a prophet, an untrustworthy prophet. He refers to someone as a prophet, and this person is trying to trip him up, right? And so you can kind of see this distrust. So on the one hand, he refers to this person as a prophet. On the other hand, he's like, you are lying. God did not say this, right?
That's what Zechariah mentions that at the end of his prophecy, that a day will come that nobody will want to be a prophet anymore.
No one will want to be a prophet, right?
And your parents will disown you if you say that you are a prophet, because it's so not trustworthy.
Right. But you see that with Nehemiah, people still are, in fact, saying that they're prophets. So at what point did it become that, discussing what Zechariah is talking about, at what point does that happen? It's not 100% clear. It is clear that at Qumran, while people at Qumran did do things that could have been called prophecy, they never called it prophecy. They only used the term prophecy to refer to the false prophecy of the other side, which tells you that once you get to Qumran, it's already a pretty clear idea that there's no more prophecy, no more real prophecy. Remember that Josephus talks about how Essenes are prophets, right? He talks about how Essenes can see the future. And he mentioned specific ones, right? I think Simon, right? So it's an interesting, so the idea is interesting. It's an interesting thing to explore, okay? So, but at a certain point, it seems to become a fairly, a standard approach that, prophecy is over, prophecy is done. But I see some more questions coming in. If a book was included in the Alexandrian Bible, did the authorities say it was Baruch HaKodesh or just worth reading? I don't know what the people in Alexandria said about the books of their Bible. I don't know. It's a much more complicated, a more complicated, because it's a much wider Bible. And it's very clear that they don't think that it's all like divine, right? Because they have a book that says this is an abridgment of a longer volume work written by such and such of Jason of Kireni, and this is you're like, so the guy who wrote it. No one's saying that he's a prophet. No one's saying that he had some kind of revelation. He just wrote this book which tells you what was happening in the war. So, and this is an abridgment of that, right? So it's clear that they have a different rule. It doesn't seem like to be in the Alexandrian Jewish Bible, you had to think that the book was divinely inspired. I'm sure that some of them they did. I'm sure that, more of the books than the Jews in Judea thought were inspired. They thought were inspired. And thanks to the Septuagint, which was a translation of these books for the Alexandrian Jewish community originally, thanks to the Septuagint, we have books like the Book of Judith. We have books like the Book of Tobit. We have books that become either very interesting or even very important, like the Book of Judith, to Jews later on, even though they kind of make their way back to Jews through translation and other unusual means, right? Books of the Maccabees are invaluable, and they would have been lost. I mean, we just didn't keep them. It's interesting. I've quoted him before, but my advisor Larry Shiffman used to say, he said the Chazal, the rabbis of the Talmud, they didn't seem to know what the names of the Maccabees were, but they're all named for Maccabees. And all the names, Yochanan, like they've all got these names of Maccabees, but they don't seem to know what the names of the Maccabees were. So it's interesting, because all these things are interesting questions. Okay, question. Why do there have to be an end to prophecy at all? Ooh, you guys are asking these great questions, and I'm just, I have to answer. I can't myself. Also, despite the general ignorance of Chazal, of the books of the Maccabees, are there any rabbinic references to those books? I don't think that there are. Okay, let me rephrase. The book, second book, the second Maccabees has the book of the woman and her 7 sons, right? So there are views that we also have in rabbinic literature with the martyrs, So I think they have a common source. I don't think they got it from the book of Second Maccabees. I don't want to say that they're ignorant of the books of the Maccabees in general, but I don't think that they cite them much. I'm sure that more work has been done. There may have been like an in-depth work finding every single little place that you could say maybe there's a parallel. But they don't, it doesn't seem like they've read the book cover to cover, put it that way. Like they don't, there's a lot of information in those books. There's a lot of information, and it doesn't seem to find its way into the rabbinic, into the rabbinic story the way we would expect. You're right. Well, yes, Hannah and her 7 sons it's Hannah and her 7 sons in the rabbinic literature. I believe that in Second Maccabees, it's Miriam and her 7 sons, if I remember correctly. Okay, why did there have to be an end of prophecy at all? Okay, it's very clear why there had to be an end of prophecy, because it's a nightmare. Prophecy, having prophets walk around saying different things and you don't know who to believe, is a nightmare, okay? And we see what kind of a nightmare it is when Yirmiyahu is dealing with it. Yirmiyahu is saying one thing, this other prophet saying something else that people like hearing a lot better. And Yirmiyahu is like, oh, don't you know the rule that if you say a good thing and it doesn't come true, like you're a false prophet, but if you see a bad thing, it doesn't come true, you're not a false prophet? Well, this is the first time we hear that rule. Like we take that rule for granted, but that's the first time we hear that rule, right? And it's a convenient rule for Yirmiyahu, who always says bad things, right? But if you're a person who's in the audience, you don't know what's going to happen and you don't know who to believe. And it's really easy to have this Torah law saying, hey, if he says something and it doesn't come true, then he's dead. That's easy until you have someone like Micha, right? Who said the temple's going to be destroyed, and it's not destroyed. So you're going to kill Micha? No, you're not going to kill Micha. And that's how the elders get Yirmiyahu out of being killed when he says the same thing, right? And that's how you can explain Yirmiyahu's rule. How does Yirmiyahu get that rule? Well, he just looks at the past. He looks at prophets who are considered to be true prophets who said bad things were going to happen. The bad things didn't happen. Look at Yonah, right? Even though I'm not saying the book of Yonah, I'm not making a statement about the date of the book of Yonah. This idea that, okay, you could say a bad thing and that can be reversed, but a good thing can't be reversed. Well, how long do you wait? Prophecy is a nightmare. It's just a headache and a half. So as soon as people start thinking, this is kind of more trouble than it's worth. And also all these prophets are, a pile of garbage, because a lot of prophets were steaming, like they were terrible, right? They asked the king, what do you want to hear? That's what we'll say. That's why you pay us, right? So there were all sorts of reasons to get rid of prophecy or to stop believing it, Yes, Joel.
This is a long time after that. Shabtai Tzvi, before him, there was a god, Azza, Natan of Azza. He was called the Navi. And mind you, he obviously prophesied. Well, he prophesied, he said that he was a Mashiach. And
false messiahs, we've always had plenty of. False messiahs, there's no lack. And in fact, and that's why you would have these false messiahs come up, and it would just cause it would cause a disaster, and people to lose faith, and people it was terrible. And and they actually caused crises. You could say a false messiah in a way is worse than a false prophet, unless the false prophet has everyone following him.
sorry,
Yeah.
Natan of Azza he said, they called him a Navi, apparently, some people did. And at the time of Shabtai Tzvi, he said,
Yeah.
interesting enough, the whole time I was at a Haredi school, they never mentioned Shabtai Tzvi or anything about
Really?
never.
Really?
It was
Huh. Where I was growing up, I knew someone named Shopsy. And we're like, how'd you get the name Shopsy? You know, the name Shopsy is from Shabtai. And he's like, we had a Shabtai Tzvi somewhere in the family line. That's how you get that name. Because they go underground, but they keep the name because they're waiting for Shabtai Tzvi to come back, right? But
Wow.
Right. So yes, there that was around Shabtai Tzvi. There were a lot of weird things going on, and people wanted to believe. If you're believing in the Messiah's coming back, why shouldn't prophecy come back? Here I see another question from Gershon. Could some of the false prophets of the distant past, those who predicted good things that didn't come true, now be vindicated by miracles of modern Israel, assuming some person or institution has standing to canonize them? I don't think we've rejected the good prophets. Like, I think the prophets that we've got, right? I mean, obviously there were prophets who said stuff that we didn't keep, right? But I mean, we kept Zechariah. We even kept prophets who said things that were clearly didn't come true. Yechezkel, in the book of Yechezkel, you have this long prophecy. It's annoying to read, and it talks about how Babylonia is going to conquer Egypt, and it doesn't. It doesn't. We know because Yechezkel then says, "Oh, that didn't happen because it was hard." We're like, "What do you mean it was hard? It was a prophecy. You said God would do it. What do you mean it was hard?" Right? But we keep the book of Yechezkel. We keep it. I point to that, right? I point to that to say, okay, look, I mean, you have this general idea this guy's a for real prophet. This thing didn't come true. This thing didn't come true. We're not hiding it. We said it right after. No one's hiding anything, right? It's like when Yirmiyahu, there's a chapter in Yirmiyahu where Yirmiyahu says, did I ask for sacrifices in the desert? And the answer is, guys, yes. In the Torah, God asked for sacrifices in the desert, right? So when do we read that chapter of Yirmiyahu as the Haftarah? When we read the parsha about sacrifices in the desert. And then we get the Haftarah. And I always feel it's like, it's rabbinic saying, deal with it. Yeah, we know. We're not hiding it. Now deal with it. So like, it's I don't know how I got to that, but there are I know because so we have chapters where we see a prophecy didn't come true. It didn't come true. And yet we don't ditch the entire prophet because there's this general idea that prophet was a true prophet. Prophecy is a disaster, but we look at our prophetic literature as one of the greatest contributions of Judaism to world culture. Yeah, our prophetic literature is fantastic, right? It's the stuff we kept, though. It's not the stuff we threw away. Anything we kept, we had to have thought was good enough to keep copying with us through exiles, right? Through everything. If you look at, like, for example, Hosea, and assuming you believe, like, there's an argument about Amos, right? Where is it actually from? But Hosea and Amos, right? So those are prophecies to the northern kingdom, right? So how do we have it? How do we have prophecies to the northern kingdom? We're the Judeans, if you remember. There was the Assyrian exile, and then they're gone, right? And then there are the Judeans who keep on writing the book of Kings, okay, now we don't have to follow them anymore. Now we're just following ourselves, right? And then we have the Judean exile. That's our Torah. The Torah is the quote unquote the Judean Bible. So how do we have these books from the northern kingdom? And the answer is because there were people from the northern kingdom who escaped. We know that. They came down to the south and they took the books that they're like, hey, these guys knew what they were talking about. And they're also great books. Hosea and Amos are great. I mean, Hosea, there were people like, I wouldn't have wanted to be his wife, right? But it's a great, but the truth is what he says about in terms of the love between God and Israel. He has some beautiful passages. And Amos says the harshest things in the most beautiful language, just amazing, right? And there's been stuff written about the development of Canaanite poetry that had to have come before for there even to be the literary level of the biblical prophets. right? But these are the books we kept. This is what we kept. I got to say, and you could, and you know, yes, I will move on now. Yeah.
There was a question that Libby asked that came before Gershon's question in the chat box.
But if you believe in prophecy, how can you just declare that it no longer exists? No problem. Prophets had already been saying it, like Zechariah, but not just Zechariah. Prophets had been saying, okay, prophecy is about to end. This is it. God, the idea is, first of all, it's very easy because there's a general idea that prophets are a gift from God. And God's like, I've been giving you these prophets and you've been not listening to them. You ungrateful jerks. Right? And he says it in more, you know, and you have it more than once in different prophetic books, right? So the idea that God is no longer giving you this gift is not super eye-opening. You're like, okay, enough is enough. God's not doing it anymore, right? And I think that probably what happened was that people saw, they're like, oh, these prophets, they're in general not reliable. We have zero faith in them. Like, I think it was a society, like they realized, they stopped having faith. They're like, these guys are frauds, and they were frauds, right? And they're like, okay, these guys are frauds. Once everyone's saying that they're frauds, then everyone's like, oh, prophecy ended. When did it end? Well, we know that Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi were good. We know that they were real prophets. So it ended after them. That's probably how it worked, right? They had to look back, right? They had to look back and say, well, who are the last ones that we know that we all agree, right? We're for real. Anyway, but I don't think it wasn't too hard to explain the end of prophecy, I think.
It's kind of strange that in beginning of Bayit Sheni, there was less of a problem that we had with Yirmiyahu, that people weren't listening to him. In Haggai, Zechariah, people started listening to the Navi, and then it ended.
It's really nice. I said these are the prophets that people listen to. It's really awesome. You could say that maybe that started with Yechezkel, because people took Yechezkel seriously, even though they have that passage that the song is based on, that people would just come to listen because it was fun. They do come, and he yells at them, and they still come, right? They come, they watch, they do things. They come to him for advice. They seem to really respect him. He doesn't, I mean, he kind of demands things from them, but there's not much they have to do. It's not like Yirmiyahu, where Yirmiyahu's like, now take this political stance. And they're like, no, right? And that happens continually. But yeah, it's really nice. It's a real change. It's nice to see them listen to prophets for once. And also saying, this is the reason the temple got built, because the prophet said it. And then people are like, oh yeah, now we have to do it. So it is kind of a nice change. Maybe that's why prophecy had to end. People started listening, and then it became very, very. I'm sure once people start listening to prophets, then it's a very tempting job to have, if people start listening to prophets instead of putting them in prison. And then that's what it pays for all the people who've been waiting in the wings to kind of fake their way through it, right? So. But anyway, okay, so let me move on. Yes.
You mentioned Amos. Amos, interestingly, is dated to the time of Yeravam ben Yoash, who, according to some scholars, was so powerful that he actually overtook Mamlechet Yehuda, and that could explain a thing or two, that there was actually a union. There was actually something of a united kingdom at that time.
Well, there's that thing where the high priest of Shomron says to him, go back and get your bread from Yehuda, right? And the idea is, he's like, you're a Judean prophet. Go back to Judah, say your Judean stuff there. They'll feed you there. And that's why Amos has to say, lo navi v'lo ben navi Anochi, right? That he says, I'm not a prophet, and I don't belong to the guild of prophets. I'm not making my money from being a prophet, right? I make my money in other ways, right? I'm a boleh shikmim. I make my money in other ways. I don't need to go for bread. I'm not going to go back to Judah where they'll pay me for saying the right stuff. I'm not getting out of your face. But it seems like Amos himself is Judean, right? It seems like Amos is Judean, and he's in the true tradition of prophets, is putting himself exactly in the place where he's not wanted, right? So
He's from Koa. He's from Koa, and Koa is deep inside Yehuda.
Right. Well, there are two. There's another idea that there's another Tekoa in the north, but it really seems from what the Kohen of Shomron says to him, it sounds like he's from the Tekoa that's in Yehuda, right? So so it sounds like he came and he's trying to. It's an interesting. Amos is talking in an interesting period because it's a time of so much plenty. And anyway, I can very easily slip into like this comparison of Amos and Hosea, and I will not. So we're going to go on. Anyone who wants a comparison of Amos and Hosea, you know where to find me. We're going to move on to some Second Temple texts that show Persian influence as we move later in Jewish history. So let's take a look. Let's take a look first at the book of Tobit. I'm not looking at the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch is very, very, it's extensive. Book of Enoch has a lot of different angels and, interacting with them and heavenly mysteries, which you could say shows like some parallels, but doesn't have to. I will say that astronomy is not Persian influence. Interest in astronomy, you will have it going way back. Babylonian scribes especially are very interested in astronomy. So please don't mix up heavenly mysteries. Not equal to astronomy. They're very interested in astronomy in the Second Temple period. They do link it to the mysteries, but that interest in astronomy has very long scribal traditions that have nothing to do with Persia. So let's move now to your handout. Let's see. We're going to take a look at your handout. It should be Tobit. What is the book of Tobit? The book of Tobit is it's hard because it's not clear when it was written. All right, it had to have been written after the Babylonian conquest of Assyria because it mentions it. It had to have written before Qumran text because it's at Qumran in Aramaic fragment. So it's probably for more or less the beginning of the Second Temple period. It places itself during the Assyrian exile. It is clearly not from the Assyrian exile. It has to be after. Pretty much, and it's written in Aramaic. The original is Aramaic. We have it in general in Greek as part of the Septuagint. Okay, so what is the story of Tobit? Tobit's a very righteous person. Okay, he gives tithes. He buries people, and this is very important. I'm going to read this to you. Now, in the days of Enemisaros, I performed many acts of charity for my kindred. I would give my bread to the hungry and clothing to the naked. And if I saw anyone of my race dead and cast out behind the wall of Nineveh, I would bury him. And if Sancherim, the king, killed anyone, when he came fleeing from Judea, I buried them by stealth, for he killed many in his anger. And the bodies were sought by the king, but they were not found. But one of the people of Nineveh went and informed the king about me that I buried them, so I hid myself. But discovering that I was being sought out to be put to death, I fled in fear. Then all my belongings were seized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so what happens to him is he's very righteous, and he's blinded because he goes to sleep by a lake and a bird poops in his eyes. And his son goes, among other things, to find a cure. He really goes to get money that he left with someone. And along the way, unbeknownst to his son, an angel accompanies him, right? We have this angel that accompanies him and essentially gives him the cure for his father's blindness. And but then he meets his cousin Sarah. His cousin Sarah, I'm going to read the section here, and I will send this to you afterwards so you'll have it. On the same day, it happened to Sarah, daughter of Raguel at Ecbatana in Medea, that she also was reproached by her father's maids, because she had been given to 7 husbands. And Asmodeus, the wicked demon, Ashmedai, had killed them before they had been with her, as is the case with wives. In other words, before they had been able to consummate the marriage, Ashmedai the demon had killed each one of the 7. So the maid said to her, "Do you not know you strangle your husbands? Already you had 7 and had no advantage from one of them. Why do you beat us? If they are dead, go with them. May we never see a son or daughter of yours." Hearing these things, she was so deeply grieved that she thought to hang herself. But she said, "I am my father's only one. If I do this, it will be a disgrace to him, and I shall bring down his old age with sorrow into Hades." But sorry, it was clearly to bring all his old age into Sheol, right? But it's the Greek translation. So she prayed toward the window and said, "Blessed are you, O Lord my God, and blessed is your holy and honored name forever." There are a lot of prayers in Tobit, right? That's one of the kind of repeating themes is how important prayer is. So she says, "You know, O Lord, that I'm pure from all sin with a man, and I did not defile my name or my father's name in the land of my captivity." So essentially what happened was that Ashmedai kind of fell in love with her, and he's like killing every one of the bridegrooms. Okay, but he's a demon, right? We're not supposed to be, this is not a romance novel. In a romance novel, she'd fall in love with a demon. This is not that, right? This is the whole thing of having sympathy for demons and finding demons attractive is a very modern phenomenon. Okay, so this Ashmedai is evil. He's killing every one of her bridegrooms because he has a thing for her. Right. So what happens is Tobit comes, he's like, "Oh, we're cousins. So you're my sister. I should marry you." Right. And everyone's like, "Good luck, kids." Because every one of her bridegrooms dies. Right. And they're like, "It's been nice knowing you." And he marries her, and the two of them, and the angel tells him, he says, like, "Take these like fish guts or something and burn them and pray. And they pray, and the Ashmedai smells the incense, and he goes off. He runs away. All right. And he marries her, and then he comes back, and the angel's given him this thing to help to cure his eyes. He cures his eyes. Everyone lives happily ever after. So there are certain things that are weird about this book. One of the weird things is the emphasis on burial. Like, why is burial such a deal? Now I'm going to cite this article, by David Brodsky, The Zoroastrian Context of the Book of Tobit. I saw it years ago. It's taken a long time for this book to come out. I remember when he first presented at AJS, and his idea was, look, why is burial not mentioned in other books? And the answer is because everyone buries their dead. It's not an unusual thing. It's not something you'd have to sneak around to do. In a Jew in a Gentile society could bury his dead like that. There was not a big deal. But you have this book talking about sneaking around burying the dead, right? And getting caught burying the dead. And who doesn't bury their dead? Zoroastrians don't bury their dead because it defiles the earth. It defiles the earth to put a dead thing in the earth. So instead, you have to have a sky burial or a what's it called? You have to burn. You have to have a cremation, right? You don't bury in the earth, right? So you're not allowed to do it. So that would be a big deal for a Jew. So what David Brodsky says, and this connects to other things also. What David Brodsky says is this is written by a Jew living in a Zoroastrian society, and he has certain problems because there's certain things that are hard for Jews living in a Zoroastrian context, and one of them is burial. Jews bury their dead. And Zoroastrians around them are like, how can you do such a thing? That is disgusting, right? But it's very, very important. Jews have to bury their dead. And so it's considered a tremendously, he's pumping it up to be this tremendously good deed that his main character does over and over at tremendous personal risk to bury one's dead. Okay, to bury the dead, your own dead and the dead of other Jews, you just go around burying people. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is, why does he keep calling his cousin his sister? Why is it so important that he marry his cousin? Because that's also part of the thing that he meets her and they're like, we're related. Now I have to marry you kind of thing. And he keeps on calling her his sister. And it's like, why? And what David Brodsky proposes is that the reason is because Zoroastrians, at least in one period, they had this thing about marrying immediate family members, marrying their sisters, marrying their mothers, right? This actually was a thing, okay, during a certain period of time. How long it lasted, I'm not 100% sure, but at least during one period of time, this was a thing. And there are theories about why this was, why they would want to do this. And he said, so Jews don't marry their sisters. So saying, well, we marry our cousins, and that's like marrying our sisters, right? So we'll just call it like marrying. See, we also do that, but with us, it's not really a sister; it's a cousin. But we call her I call her my sister, right? So it's a way of a Jew dealing in a Zoroastrian society. Some of the things he takes a little too far, I think. But I think he makes some very valid points, especially the thing with the burial, because it's very striking. When you read the book of Tobit, this thing with the burial comes out of nowhere. Now, of course, Ashmedai himself is meant to reflect the main bad demon, right, in Zoroastrian mythology, right? However, as has been pointed out, I forgot the first person who pointed this out. In this story, Ashmedai is made very minimal. In other words, Ashmedai, instead of being the main demon of the world, right? Instead of being the main demon of the world, he's instead this demon who just decides to hang around this girl and kill all her husbands because he has a thing for her. And they get rid of him with a little bit of incense. Burn up some fish guts and he's gone, right? And I think that's actually a really typical of the way a lot of Jewish texts deal with demons. In fact, there's someone who's written about how in rabbinic texts they make demons kind of easy to control and kind of sometimes even silly. They do things that make the demon much less important and powerful while still calling them a demon, right? So he's still a demon, but he's not this major powerful demon, and he's not something that's hard to control. He's kind of petty, and they get rid of him easily, and with some prayer to God, and everything ends up fine. Okay, so that's in the book of Tobit. Now let's go on and look at some Qumran texts, which are, and I know that we're going a little long. I'll try and do this quickly. We're looking at some Qumran texts, which also have typically been pointed to as showing Persian Zoroastrian influence. And this is a little bit, this is kind of interesting. So I'm looking now at your handout, Qumran and Persian parallels. Okay. All right, so I'm looking from the beginning. Now there's what am I reading? One of the central documents at Qumran was the community rule. It was found in cave 1, right? Cave 1, they were numbered in the order in which they were found, okay? So the community rule was considered very, very important by the community. Now, it was also considered very, very important by researchers and scholars, because in the beginning, scholars had mainly stuff from the first caves. They didn't have everything from cave 4. And so everything that they had got a tremendous amount of importance. If you read early books on Qumran, they will usually talk about the treatise of those two spirits as the Theology of Quran. This is before they realized just how much stuff there was from Qumran, and that the treatise of two spirits was, frankly, a couple chapters and one text, and that's it. All right. So it's not the Theology of Qumran. It's actually a fairly unusual text that doesn't match most of the other Qumran documents and shows some clear, that it seems to reflect some clear outside influence. It's not necessarily Persian influence, but outside influence. It doesn't match a lot of other Qumran stuff in terms of terminology, et cetera, et cetera. This is in the community rule. So if we take a look at the first page of the handout, Qumran and Persian parallels, we have, it is for the maskil to understand and teach all the children of light concerning the nature of all the children of man, right? So it's given this, they say, okay, this, excuse me, to the maskil, who is a leader of the community, he needs to teach everyone this. Now, we don't have, this is in the cave 1 copy of the community rule. It's not in the cave 4 copy of the community rule. So it's clearly important. It's hard to know how important exactly and how central and how much everyone read it. So it's an unusual text, and I only brought a piece because it's kind of long. So let's go back to the next section. And he placed 2 spirits for him in which to walk until the important time of his appointment, namely the spirits of truth and deceit. And a spring of light is the beginning of truth, and from a well of darkness is the beginning of deceit. In the hand of the Prince of Lights is the dominion of all the children of righteousness. In the ways of light they walk. And in the hands of the angel of darkness is the dominion of the children of deceit. And in the ways of darkness they walk. Due to the angel of darkness is the straying of all the children of righteousness, and all their sins, their iniquities, their guilt, and their iniquitous works are caused by his dominion, according to God's mysteries until his period. And all their afflictions and the appointed times of their suffering are caused by the dominion of his hostility. Now I want to point something out here. Okay, so we have the angel of darkness, okay, and we have the angel of darkness, and we have the Prince of Lights. Okay, angel. These are still fairly unusual terms. Prince of Lights, you don't have a lot in the Qumran text. You have like once in the Damascus document, and angel of darkness also unusual. But the angel of darkness seems to be parallel the way they're talking to him to Belial, right? Saying that he's ruling, right? That's the way they talk about Belial. There's Megillat Belial during this period when Belial rules. Do you guys prefer that I share my screen so that you see the text as I'm reading it? Yeah? Okay. Here we are. Okay. All right. So this is, here we have the translation of the Qumran text. Okay. So you have the angel of darkness, the Prince of Lights, right? And everyone is split in between them. You have the children of righteousness walking the way of the Prince of Light, and the children of deceit walking the way of the angel of darkness. Note the determinism that you're already seeing here, that this is the way it works, that you have the ones each belong to each, the ones who belong to each. There are other places where it says that specifically that this is from the beginning. So all of this, and their iniquitous works are caused by his dominion according to God's mysteries until this period. And all their afflictions and the appointed times of their suffering are caused by the dominion of his hostility. Okay, so again, the dominion, like Megillat Belial. And all the spirits of his lot caused to stumble the children of light, but the God of Israel and his angel of truth helped all the children of light. He created the spirits of light and darkness, and upon them he founded every work. So not only does the angel of darkness cause his followers to sin, he also causes the children of light to stumble, right? But the God of Israel and his angel of truth help them. Now, note that here we have, let's see here, the Megillat Mastemato, right? The dominion of his hostility. This actually is referring, so you have Megillat Belial, the dominion of Belial, and here you're talking about the dominion of this angel of darkness, of his hostility. Mastemato also connects this to Prince Mastema in Jubilees. So people who are reading this would automatically connect this character to both Belial and the angel Mastema, right? Who's the bad guy in Jubilees. So it is connecting to other things, but it's using different terminology. And all the glory of man, we're talking about the good guys, the children of light, shall be theirs, and there will be no deceit. All false works will be put to shame. Until now, the spirits of truth and deceit struggle in the heart of humans. This is now switching. So instead of it being an angel and a prince of light, an angel of darkness and a prince of light, and they're kind of ruling everyone, now all of a sudden there's spirits of truth and deceit struggling in the heart of humans. And so they walk in wisdom or vileness. According to a man's share in truth shall he be righteous and thus hate deceit. And according to his inheritance in the law of deceit, he shall be evil through it and thus loathe truth. So all of a sudden they've become these spirits within one, and you have pieces of you. You have this kind of a lot, but you can be partly one and partly the other. For God has set them as equals until the time of that which has been decided and the making of the new. He knows the reward of their work for all the end of their appointed times, and he allots them to the children of man for knowledge of good, and thus deciding the lots of every living being according to his spirit. All right, so it's unusual for Qumran, but it does reflect other ideas. It reflects a certain dualism that's known at Qumran, a certain determinism, but it uses different terminology and characters that we're not used to hearing about, even if they connect other characters at Qumran. So the Persian parallel that people usually point to are from the Gathas. The Gathas are prayers. They're written originally in Old Avestan, which was already extinct by the 3rd century. So this is the thing. So Zoroastrianism, old Zoroastrianism, is let's say 1500 to 1000 BC. Old Avestan is a very old language. So what we use in order to understand the Gathas is we use the Middle Persian. We use Vedic Sanskrit, which has certain parallels, but is very problematic. And there's a Middle Persian translation. Middle Persian itself is very hard to understand. And Middle Persian translation, then we're already in the Sasanian period. So in the Sasanian period, there were certain ways they had of understanding these prayers. These are prayers, right? That these are prayers supposed to be coming. They're supposedly written by Zarathustra himself, right? So you're talking about super, super old, okay? So these really old prayers that are now being interpreted, that we're trying to interpret by using Middle Persian interpretations, and we don't know. So there are a lot of questions whenever we try to work with these. But I'm using the translation that I have. Truly for seekers, I shall speak of those things to be pondered, even by one who already knows, with praise and worship for the Lord of good purpose. Now I'm reading the Persian now. This has nothing to do with Judaism or Qumran. It's the Persian Zoroastrian prayer, okay? With praise and worship for the Lord of good purpose, the excellently wise one, and for truth. Hear with your ears the best things. Reflect with clear purpose, each man for himself, on the two choices for decision, being alert indeed to declare yourselves for him before the great requital. Truly, there are two primal spirits, twins renowned to be in conflict. In thought and word, in act, they are two, the better and the bad. And those who act well have chosen rightly between these two, not so the evildoers. And when these two spirits first came together, they created life and not life. And how at the end worst existence shall be for the wicked, but the house of best purpose for the just man. Of these two spirits, the wicked one chose achieving the worst things. The most holy spirit, who is clad in heart of stone, chose right, and so do those who shall satisfy Lord Mazda continually with rightful acts. Then when retribution comes for these sinners, then Mazda, power shall be present for thee with good purpose, declare himself for those, Lord, who shall deliver the lie into the hands of truth. Now, if we look back here to our, you see, until now, the spirits of truth and deceit struggle in the heart of humans. So you have it called, being also called lies and truth. Okay, they walk in wisdom or vileness, for God has set them as equals until the time of that which has been decided, right? He knows the reward of their works for all the end of their appointed times. In lots of the children, so you have a lot of parallels between the idea of these two spirits in Qumran and these two spirits in the Gathas. Okay. However, one of the things that you should note here is how much choice is, how central choice is. Okay. Here you have, and those who act well have chosen rightly between these two, right? On the two choices for decision. So in the Persian text, you have choice. The idea is you've chosen correctly, right? You need to choose between these two, right? Whereas in the Qumran text that we read before, it's much more deterministic. It sounds like you're born one way or the other. Now, it's not that unusual, and I've talked at other times about how at Qumran itself, you absolutely do have choice in certain places being emphasized, but not here, not in this place where they're talking about the two spirits. Okay, so but there's another text at Qumran, which I actually think is even more parallel to the Gathas here. And there's a question that this piece answers. I'm going to stop screen sharing for just a second. And that is, the question is, how did they get it? So people say, okay, great. So you have all these parallels between this old Avestan Zoroastrian prayer and something at Qumran, written in Hebrew. How do they even understand old Avestan? Like, how would they have read this prayer? It was already dying out when they were like, it was very like priests knew it, but like it wasn't the sort of thing that people could just read. Certainly not in Judea. How would they know this stuff? So what I think actually, and it's a hypothesis I put forth, but I don't think it's going to go anywhere because I don't write enough. But what I think is actually that probably it found its way into folklore. In other words, it works as a story to talk about these spirits that you have to choose between that are kind of equal, and you have to choose between truth and lie, light and dark, and then and you have to make the right choice. And I'll explain now. I'm going to share my screen again, and this is on. This is also in your handouts in the continuation of that same one. And if you see the visions of Amram, Okay, the visions of Amram probably didn't originate at Qumran. All right, you can see that it's in Aramaic. All right, but it was found at Qumran. And in the visions of Amram, so Amram has a dream. Okay, and I'm going to scroll down to the English. Okay, he has a dream, and there are two copies here. They kind of overlap. All right. So, for I would return to Egypt safely and see my wife's face. I saw in my vision, the vision of the dream, and there were two figures arguing over me and saying, and holding a great dispute over me. So I asked them, how is it that you have authority over me? They said, we rule, and we rule over all humans. And they said to me, which of us do you seek? I lifted my eyes and saw one of them whose appearance was molting like a serpent, and all his clothing was multicolored and very dark. And I saw another, and in his appearance and his face was laughing, and he was covered with a garment. And then the continuation said, something rules over you. Who is this? He said to me, this one is something, and Melchi Resha, ruler of wickedness. And I said, my Lord, what is the dominion? Darkness. All his work is darkness, and he leads into darkness. You see, and he rules over all darkness, while I, from the height to the earth, I am ruler over all light. So what do we see here? What does this seem to be? A story of, it seems to be he's having a dream about the angel of darkness and the angel of light. They're arguing over him, right? Who is he going to choose? Who's he going to belong to? Now that's actually very parallel to what we read in the Gathas, where you've got these two spirits that are created and you have to choose between right? And they're created twins, right? What I think is, how did these Persian ideas get to the trees of the two spirits? They got there through stories that people told, because that's the easiest way to kind of transmit these ideas. If you're Jews, you're living in a Persian context, you're talking to Persians, right? And the Persians can tell the story. Everyone has these two spirits they have to choose between, right? And then you could have that story coming into this writing about Amram's dream, that he dreamt of these two spirits he has to choose between. I'm not saying that the visions of Amram influenced the treatise of the two spirits at Qumran, right? I'm saying that this is how it would have happened, that the treatise of the two spirits could reflect the same idea that you have in the Gathas through folklore. And that's a possibility, I think, in terms of the dualism as well. Dualism, which is very, very strong at Qumran, and which you have, of course, a lot of in Zoroastrianism, where you have the good and the bad spiritual rulers, and they split things between them. Now there is a difference, which is, let me see if I have the here. So in Zoroastrianism, they have something called Gumezishin, which is the current period is a mixture of good and evil. Okay, because you have Ahura Mazda and you have Angra Mainyu. Okay, Ahura Mazda is Lord Wisdom, and Angra Mainyu is the evil spirit, right? And in this period, you have them both. It's mixed, Gumezishin, right? The difference, but at Qumran, you have Blial and you have God, right? And Blial rules right now. Right now, you have Mimshel Blial, so they're much more pessimistic than you have in Qumran, right? But you do have this idea of dualism, which you could say, how were they even thinking that way? Because dualism is not particularly biblical in any way. Not only is dualism not biblical, the Satan is barely biblical. He is biblical. You have the Satan in the Bible, but you start seeing him as a character in the beginning of the Second Temple period, right? When you have the retelling of the story, where David is, he's led astray by God to count the people, right? And which causes a curse. Okay. He's in the parallel in Divrei Yamim and Chronicles, who leads him astray? Guess who would lead him astray? Not God.
Son.
So the Satan leads him astray. Satan leads him astray, right? Now, you say, well, in Eov, Satan is a real character. Yes, but the frame of Eov seems to be kind of late. I do think that the frame of Eov is Second Temple, even if the body of Eov is much, much, much earlier. In other words, the poetry part of Eov, but the prose envelope of Eov seems to be later. Okay, so in other words, even Satan as a character, and that's also something that in Persian thought was very popular, that you have this satanic character that's in charge of all evil, and you have this dualism. The problem is that in Judaism, you can't have pure dualism. It doesn't work, because you've got God who's got to be in control of everything, Even in Zoroastrianism, frankly, it's kind of problematic. But in Judaism, you can't do that. So they have to play these games. Oh, well, Belial's given permission now, but he's going to end at the end of time, things like that. I know I've gone way over. My apologies. I will just address the questions and then I will end our evening. Anyone who wants to go now, it was lovely talking to you, and thank you for staying. Bye-bye. I have a question here. Amram's dream doc was found at Qumran, but not of Qumran. Explain how we know this. We don't know this for sure. It seems if it had been of Qumran, it probably would have been written in Hebrew. In general, when they wrote their Qumran text, they wanted to be official Qumran text, they wrote them in Hebrew. And it doesn't have sectarian terminology. It doesn't have, there's nothing particularly sectarian in it. So there's no reason why you should say that it's sectarian. You could in theory say, well, they decided to write in Aramaic. Generally, when they wrote sectarian stuff, they usually wrote it in Hebrew, and they usually use, usually they have sectarian terminology and ideas, and that's not in Visions of Amram, but there are always arguments about these things. You don't know for sure. There's no way to know for sure. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good night, and thanks for your patience. Take care.